Do you even understand what U.S. law is? Officer Ethan Walker asked it like a joke, loud enough for every traveler in the inspection lane to hear, and the cruel little pause after the question did more damage than the words themselves. It spread through the checkpoint like cold air from an open freezer door, brushing across steel counters, plastic bins, rolling suitcases, and the tired faces of people who had already learned that silence was safer than dignity. Naomi Carter stood on the faded yellow line with her passport in one hand and her leather satchel tucked beneath her arm, her navy coat still carrying the dust of a long drive and the faint scent of rain that had passed 20 miles back. She did not look like someone who had come to fight. She looked like a woman in her 40s who had spent years carrying books heavier than most people's opinions, a woman who knew how to stand still without surrendering an inch of herself. Walker lifted her passport between two fingers as if it offended him. He gave her a slow once-over, taking in her dark skin, her natural curls pinned back neatly, her sensible shoes, her quiet face, and whatever story he had already decided to write about her before she had said a word. Behind her, the line shortened its breathing. A toddler stopped fussing. A man in a ball cap lowered his eyes. Somewhere above them, a fluorescent light buzzed with the dry, relentless hum of a place built for procedure, not mercy. You people always get nervous when we ask simple questions, Walker said, smirking now, enjoying the stage, enjoying the badge on his chest, and the weak kind of power that only grew in rooms where nobody wanted trouble. Naomi's gaze did not rise to his face right away. It moved first to the form in his hand, then to the checkbox he had marked, then to the timestamp, then to the printed code at the bottom of the page. She noticed the details the way other people notice danger in a stranger's tone. The radio on his shoulder crackled. A metal drawer slammed somewhere behind the counter. He asked another question, but Naomi was no longer listening to his performance. She was reading his mistake. When she finally looked up, her expression was calm enough to make his grin falter just for a second. Actually, she said, her voice low and even, what you just did violates federal due process. The sentence landed with the clean weight of a gavel. No one moved. Walker blinked once, then laughed too quickly, like a man stepping onto a stair he thought would be there. Excuse me, he said. Naomi shifted her satchel higher on her shoulder and glanced once more at the form, as if confirming what she already knew. You marked a detention basis without lawful threshold, and you're holding my documents without articulable cause, she said, each word precise, unhurried, impossible to confuse with bluffing. A phone rose 3 people back in the line. Then another. Walker's hand tightened around the passport. The mockery remained on his face, but now it was working harder than it had a moment ago. Naomi took one small step closer to the counter, not aggressive, not afraid, just near enough for him to hear the next sentence without pretending he hadn't. So before you embarrass yourself any further, Officer Walker, she said, her eyes resting briefly on the name stitched above his pocket, you may want to read the statute you're pretending to enforce. Walker stared at her as if the checkpoint itself had betrayed him. The grin stayed on his mouth, but it no longer belonged there. It looked pasted on now, thin and brittle beneath the white glare of the overhead lights. Naomi Carter did not raise her voice. She did not need to. The stillness around her was doing half the work already. People in line had stopped pretending not to listen. The older woman behind Naomi lowered her sunglasses. A college-aged boy with a duffel bag shifted his phone a little higher, careful, almost reverent, as if he sensed he was recording the exact second a lie began to crack. Walker tapped the edge of the detention form against the metal counter. You are making a lot of assumptions for someone standing at my checkpoint, he said. Naomi's eyes moved once to the small body camera clipped near his chest, then back to his face. And you are making a lot of errors for someone wearing a federal badge, she answered. The words were calm, but they carried the sharpness of something measured and exact. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. That pause told its own story. Naomi had seen that pause before in courtrooms, faculty meetings, and public hearings. It was the silence that came when authority expected fear and met competence instead. She shifted her satchel to her other shoulder, the leather creaking softly. Inside were lecture notes, 2 casebooks full of yellow tabs, and a folder stamped with the seal of Westbridge School of Law. where she taught constitutional law to students who often arrived believing the law was a fortress and left understanding it was only as honorable as the people enforcing it. Naomi had spent 12 years in classrooms, teaching future attorneys how power disguised itself. Sometimes it sounded polished and official. Sometimes it sounded like a joke told too loudly in a room where no one dared object. Walker glanced down at the form in his own hand, just for a second, and Naomi noticed it immediately. There it was, the first retreat. He had checked the wrong basis for extended review. He had logged the hold before he had even asked the follow-up question he would now claim justified it. He had created the appearance of protocol, but not the substance. Naomi knew the difference the way a pilot knows wind by the movement of a wing. "Would you like me to explain your own paperwork to you?" she asked. A murmur flickered through the line and died just as fast. Walker straightened. "I do not need legal advice from a traveler." Naomi's expression did not change. "That is fortunate," she said, "because what you need is legal training." The radio on the far desk crackled again. Somewhere in the back, a printer started up, spitting out a sheet with a dry mechanical rhythm. The sounds made the silence feel even larger. Naomi could feel the eyes on her now, not with pity anymore, but with the cautious attention people gave to someone stepping into danger without flinching. She knew that look. She had worn it herself as a girl in Georgia, watching her father come home from a courthouse janitor job with tired shoulders and polished shoes, telling her in a voice full of quiet thunder that the law was not supposed to belong only to the loudest man in the room. Walker leaned forward. "You think because you memorized a few words, you can come in here and tell me how to do my job?" Naomi held his gaze, steady and unblinking. "No," she said. "I know that because I teach the Constitution for a living." The effect of her words did not end with Walker. It moved outward, touching the room in slow, invisible circles, and for the first time since Naomi had stepped onto the yellow line, the checkpoint no longer felt like his alone. Still, the place had been built to favor men like him. Everything in it carried the hard geometry of authority. The counter was bolted down. The glass partition was thick enough to turn a human voice into something flatter, smaller, easier to dismiss. Monitors glowed behind him with scrolling entries, badge numbers, alerts, and coded abbreviations that looked neutral until a person decided how to use them. Above the inspection lanes, cameras watched from dark corners without blinking. A flag hung stiff in the conditioned air. The room smelled faintly of dust, printer toner, and old coffee that had been reheated too many times. It was the kind of place where paperwork could become a wall and a question could become an accusation simply because the person asking it wore the right patch on his shoulder. Officer Ethan Walker had learned how to inhabit that machinery so completely that he no longer seemed to notice it. He stood with one palm resting near the terminal, shoulders squared, jaw set, every inch of him trained to project certainty whether he possessed it or not. Men like him did not need to shout all the time. Sometimes all they had to do was lean back, let the silence stretch, and wait for the other person to become smaller. Naomi saw that kind of power clearly because she had spent years studying what it did to people. In her classroom, she often told her students that power rarely announced itself as cruelty on the first day. It arrived as routine. It called itself protocol. It hid inside forms, tone, delay, and selective suspicion. It smiled just before it excluded you. Walker's smile had done exactly that. It had tried to make the room believe he was the law instead of a man temporarily entrusted to apply it. Naomi's face stayed composed, but her mind was working with clean, disciplined speed. She took in the second officer at the far desk who had stopped typing without admitting he was listening. She noted the supervisor's office. Window above the corridor, the blinds half open, the movement behind them faint but real. She noticed the digital clock over the exit door, red numbers changing with stubborn precision, and she thought about how every extra minute at a checkpoint could become its own kind of punishment when someone in uniform decided your time did not matter. The students she taught would have recognized this scene from case law. The fluorescent lights, the elevated counter, the implied threat of delay, the invisible line between questioning and coercion. But to Naomi, it was not abstract. It was American. It was a system wrapped in metal and procedure, asking the oldest question in the country in a new voice. Who gets presumed innocent, and who must earn ordinary respect? Walker shifted his stance and set her passport down, but not close enough for her to take it. Even that was a gesture of control. He wanted the room to see that he still decided distance, still decided timing, still decided what happened next. Naomi let the silence rest on him for one measured breath. Then she looked beyond his shoulder, toward the rows of screens and sealed doors and government emblems that had taught him to confuse position with wisdom, and she understood something with perfect clarity. This was not merely about one rude officer at one checkpoint on one dry American afternoon. This room had made him comfortable. This room had taught him that suspicion sounded professional when it targeted the right face. And if she was going to expose him, she would have to expose the room with him. Naomi did not reach for her passport. That was the first thing that unsettled him. Most people, once they sensed a delay might end, moved instinctively toward relief. They grabbed their documents, nodded too quickly, and hurried away with that thin, grateful smile people wore when they had just been reminded that ordinary freedom could be withheld. Naomi stayed exactly where she was. Her hand rested lightly on the strap of her satchel. Her breathing remained even. She let Officer Ethan Walker sit inside his own discomfort for a few seconds longer, and under the pale fluorescent light, those seconds began to show on his face. "You teach law," he said, drawing the words out as if he had found something amusing in them. "That is supposed to impress me?" Naomi tilted her head just enough to signal that she had heard him and judged the question unworthy of much effort. "No," she said. "It is supposed to inform you." A low sound moved through the line behind her. Not quite laughter, not quite surprise, but the unmistakable shift that came when a crowd realized the person being cornered might actually be in control. Walker heard it too. His jaw tightened. He slid the detention form across the counter toward himself and turned the page at an angle, shielding it with his forearm. That tiny motion told Naomi more than any speech could have. He knew there was weakness in the paper now. He just had not decided whether pride would let him admit it. Naomi had spent most of her adult life studying men who confused challenge with disrespect, judges who hated correction, administrators who called scrutiny unprofessional, officers who believed being questioned by the right person was civic order and being questioned by the wrong person was insubordination. She knew the pattern well enough to hear its rhythm before the next line arrived. "Step to secondary," Walker said. The words dropped flat and official, but they came a beat too late. Naomi glanced toward the marked doorway to the right, a gray metal door beneath a sign that looked cleaner than the wall around it. She could already picture the room behind it. Plastic chairs, a bolted table, stale air, and no clocks. The architecture of delay. "On what legal basis?" she asked. Walker lifted his chin. "On my determination." Naomi's eyes settled on him with a patience so complete it almost felt merciful. "That is not a legal basis," she said. "That is an ego with a badge." The man with the duffel bag coughed into his fist to hide what might have been a laugh. The older woman behind Naomi looked down quickly, but not before a small smile touched the corner of her mouth. Walker noticed everything now. The room that had once amplified him was beginning to reflect him back. He did not like what he saw. He tapped the form again, then jabbed at one printed line with his finger. "Suspicious conduct," he said. Naomi leaned forward just enough to read the entry without touching the paper. Her eyes moved once across the line, then again to the time stamp above it. "When?" She spoke. Her voice stayed level, but something in it had sharpened into pure steel. "That notation was entered before you asked your follow-up question," she said. "Which means you decided I was suspicious before you gathered any new facts. That is not observation. That is pretext." The second officer at the far desk stopped pretending to work. Naomi saw him in her peripheral vision, still as stone now, one hand hovering above the keyboard. Walker tried to recover with volume. "You do not get to stand here and dictate policy." Naomi did not blink. "I am not dictating policy," she said. "I am identifying misconduct." The word landed harder than the others had. Misconduct. It was no longer about tone. It was no longer about attitude. It was about record, liability, review. Naomi could almost feel the atmosphere change temperature. The supervisor's office window above the corridor showed movement again, clearer this time, a shadow pausing behind the half-open blinds. Walker followed her gaze without meaning to, then looked back too fast. There it was, the second retreat. Fear did not always arrive dramatically. Sometimes it entered through the smallest possible opening, like air under a door. Naomi saw it happen in him and understood that he was now fighting two battles at once, one against her knowledge and one against the possibility that someone else in the building had started listening. She let that realization ripen before she spoke again. "You can still correct this," she said quietly. "Return my documents, clear the form, and end the detention before your mistake becomes a report." Walker's fingers tightened on the paper. His badge caught the overhead light and flashed once, cold and silver against the broad rise of his chest. For a moment he said nothing at all. Then he gave a short, brittle smile that did not reach his eyes. "You think you have me cornered," he said. Naomi looked at the form, the timestamp, the camera above him, the gathering attention in the room, and then back at the man who had mistaken humiliation for authority. "No," she said. "I think you walked there by yourself." Walker let out a slow breath through his nose and looked down at the form as if he could bend reality by staring at the ink hard enough. The room had changed on him, and he knew it. A few minutes earlier, every sound in the checkpoint had seemed to confirm his control. The radio chatter, the tapping keys, the rolling suitcases, the tired silence of strangers waiting to be told who they were allowed to be. Now those same sounds felt thinner, less loyal. Naomi Carter could hear it too. The building had not become kinder. It had simply begun paying attention. Walker placed both hands on the counter and leaned forward, trying to reclaim the space between them. "You are making this difficult," he said. Naomi's expression stayed still. "No," she answered. "I am making it visible." He gave a sharp, humorless laugh. "Visible?" He glanced around, gesturing to the line as if the very presence of witnesses proved he had nothing to hide. "This is routine." Naomi looked at the detention form again. "Routine becomes dangerous when nobody questions it," she said. Walker's eyes hardened. He picked up her passport, flipped it once, and set it back down just out of reach, a petty movement dressed up as procedure. "You know what your problem is?" he asked. Naomi did not answer. He did not need permission. Men like him rarely did. "You walk in here already convinced this is about race." The words landed with practiced contempt, as if he had used them before, as if they were part of the script he reached for whenever he needed to drag the conversation away from facts and into accusation. Naomi felt the old familiar chill of that tactic, the one that tried to make the injured person defend their perception instead of the other person defending their conduct. But she had taught too many young lawyers to fall for it now. "No," she said, almost gently. "I walked in here convinced this was about law. You turned it into something else the moment you decided I looked suspicious before you had a reason." The silence that followed had edges. The older woman behind Naomi shifted her purse higher onto her shoulder. The young man with the duffel bag kept recording, his arm beginning to tremble from holding the phone still for so long. At the far desk, the second officer looked down at his screen, but his eyes were not moving. Walker straightened, and the brittle smile came back, thinner than before. "You people always think every inconvenience is oppression." There it was. Not loud, not theatrical, just ugly. Enough to remove any remaining doubt about who he was when he believed nobody would challenge him. Naomi held his gaze and felt something inside herself go very quiet. Not wounded. Focused. She had heard better-dressed versions of the same sentence at conferences, in court hallways, in faculty receptions where civility did its best to perfume prejudice. But stripped of polish, under the hard white lights of a checkpoint, it sounded exactly like what it was. "Small. And men like you," she said, "always mistake accountability for disrespect." Walker opened his mouth to answer, but another sound cut across the room first. A door opened above the corridor. Not slammed. Not rushed. Just opened. Calmly. Deliberately. Naomi saw the shift in Walker's shoulders before she saw the reflection in the glass. Someone was coming down from the supervisor's office. His confidence did not disappear all at once. It flickered, like a bulb about to fail. He looked at the passport in his hand, then at the form, then toward the corridor, and for the first time since Naomi had stepped to his counter, he seemed to understand that this moment might outlast the room. It might become paperwork. It might become review. It might become memory in other people's mouths. Naomi did not move. She simply stood there in her navy coat, one hand on the strap of her satchel, posture steady, eyes clear, while the sound of measured footsteps drew closer on the tile. And when Walker finally looked back at her, there was something new in his face, something he had not worn before. Not humility. Not yet. but the first thin crack in certainty. The footsteps did not rush. That was what changed the air most. They came down the corridor with the slow, measured certainty of someone who did not need to perform authority because the building already recognized it. Naomi Carter heard them before she turned her head. One step, then another, clean against the tile, steady as a metronome. Officer Ethan Walker heard them too, and the effect on him was immediate, though slight enough that anyone who had not been watching closely might have missed it. His shoulders lifted, then stiffened. The fingers holding Naomi's passport adjusted their grip. A pulse appeared once in his jaw. Naomi stayed still. She had no interest in dramatic gestures. Silence was already doing the heavier work. The line behind her remained frozen in that particular American way people went still when they sensed a confrontation was crossing from personal insult into official consequence. The overhead lights hummed on. The radio at the far desk crackled and went quiet again. Somewhere near the entrance, the rubber wheel of a suitcase squeaked once across the floor and stopped. Then Captain Daniel Reeves appeared at the end of the corridor in a pressed uniform shirt with his sleeves buttoned and a folder tucked beneath one arm. He was in his 50s, broad-shouldered, close-cropped gray at the temples, the kind of man whose face had learned long ago that leadership was more convincing when it wasted fewer words. He did not look at Naomi first. He looked at Walker, then at the form in Walker's hand, then at the phone held up in the line behind Naomi, and only after that did his gaze settle on the woman at the counter. Naomi met his eyes without challenge and without deference. She saw calculation there, but not contempt. That mattered. What is the status here? Reeves asked. Walker answered too quickly. Routine review, sir. The traveler became argumentative. Naomi almost smiled, but did not. She had heard that word before as well. Argumentative. A useful label for any woman who refused to cooperate with her own humiliation. Reeves did not react. Is that the basis for the hold? He asked. Walker glanced at the form. Suspicious conduct, he said. The words sounded flatter now, less like procedure and more like something borrowed. Reeves extended his hand. Let me see it. Walker passed over the document. For the first time since this began, Naomi allowed herself a slow breath through her nose. Not relief. Timing. She watched Reeves read. His eyes moved across the page once, then again, more slowly the second time. His thumb paused at the timestamp. His expression did not change, but the room felt him noticing. Naomi knew that feeling well. It was the moment a classroom shifted just before a student realized the answer they had defended with confidence was wrong at its foundation. Reeves lifted his eyes from the paper. What conduct? He asked. Walker opened his mouth. No answer came immediately. Naomi could hear the fluorescent lights again. She could hear her own heartbeat, low and controlled, not racing but present, like a second clock beneath the one above the exit. Walker tried again. She challenged procedure. Naomi let the sentence hang there, naked and insufficient. Reeves turned his head slightly toward her. Ma'am. The invitation was small, but it was there. Naomi kept her voice even. I asked for the legal basis of my detention after he entered the notation before developing any articulable facts, withheld my documents, and made remarks that suggest the suspicion preceded the inquiry. Reeves studied her face for a moment, then the satchel at her side, then the books visible where the zipper had parted by an inch. A yellow tab marked a page in a constitutional law casebook. It was a tiny detail, but Naomi saw him register it. She saw him understand that this was not improvisation. Walker shifted his weight. Sir, with respect, she is trying to sound technical. Naomi turned her eyes to him then, and her voice dropped into a quiet that made people lean closer. No, she said. I am trying to sound accurate. Reeves did not look away from the form. Were there any additional facts beyond what is written here? He asked. Walker hesitated. That hesitation was longer than the last one. Longer than any officer should have needed if the paperwork reflected reality. Naomi did not interrupt. She simply stood in the white light with her passport still out of reach, her dignity intact, and let the truth make its own entrance. And when Reeves finally raised his head again, the checkpoint no longer felt like a stage for Walker at all. It felt like a room waiting to see which version of authority would win. Walker did not answer Captain Reeves right away, and in that delay the truth became easier to hear than any explanation he might have offered. Naomi Carter watched his face with the same quiet attention she gave a witness under pressure in a classroom exercise, not because she wanted to embarrass him, but because she understood what happened when certainty finally ran out. His eyes flicked once to the form, then to the camera above the lane, then to the row of waiting travelers who had gone so still they seemed to have become part of the architecture. The hard confidence he had worn all afternoon had not vanished, but it was coming apart at the edges now, fraying under the weight of details he could no longer command. Captain Reeves kept his hand on the paperwork and asked the question again, this time without raising his voice. Were there any additional facts? Walker swallowed before he spoke. She was evasive. Naomi did not interrupt. She let the words sit in the air long enough to reveal how empty it was. Reeves looked at the form, then at Walker. That is not documented. Walker straightened slightly, as if posture alone might restore his position. I made a judgment call. Reeves lowered the paper by an inch. A judgment call requires judgment. The sentence landed softly, but it drew a visible line between them. Naomi felt the room absorb it. At the far desk, the other officer stopped looking at his screen altogether. The young man with the duffel bag held his phone so still now that even his trembling had calmed. The older woman behind Naomi exhaled slowly, almost like someone who had been underwater longer than she realized. Walker's face changed in small, involuntary ways. The corners of his mouth tightened. The skin around his eyes pulled thin. He was not simply being corrected. He was being seen. And that, Naomi knew, was often more frightening to people like him than punishment itself. Captain Reeves turned to her with a level expression. Ma'am, you stated that the notation was entered before any lawful basis had been developed. Naomi nodded once. Yes, sir. The timestamp reflects that. The entry predates the follow-up inquiry. His suspicion was recorded first and rationalized afterward. Reeves checked the page again, his thumb resting near the digital time field. He did not need long. Numbers had a way of stripping pride from a room. Is that accurate, Officer Walker? He asked. Walker looked at the form as if he were seeing it for the first time. The system clocks do not always sync exactly, he said, but even he could hear how weak it sounded. Naomi saw the answer hit him before anyone else did. It came not from Reeves, not from the line, not from the camera in the corner, but from the simple fact that his own defense had become smaller than the record in his hand. He had expected resistance from Naomi. He had not expected precision. He had expected emotion he could dismiss, outrage he could label, a raised voice he could contain. Inside policy language. Instead, he had found a woman who understood the law well enough to make his authority answer to it. That realization settled on him with a quiet, humiliating clarity. For the first time, he looked at Naomi not as a traveler he could delay, but as a mind he could not out-talk. And in that moment, under the cold white lights and the unblinking cameras, Officer Ethan Walker finally understood the thing he should have known before he ever touched her passport. He had not stopped an ordinary woman on an ordinary afternoon. He had singled out someone who knew exactly where power ended, exactly where misconduct began, and exactly how thin the distance was between a badge and a record of disgrace. Captain Reeves did not raise his voice when he made the decision. That was part of what made it final. He looked at the form one last time, then at Naomi Carter, then back at Officer Ethan Walker, and the silence between those 3 points seemed to settle the entire checkpoint into place. Clear the hold, he said. The words were plain, unadorned, and absolute. Walker did not move at first. He stood behind the counter with Naomi's passport still in his hand, as if some stubborn part of him believed delay might still protect him. Reeves held out his hand without repeating himself. After a moment that felt longer than it was, Walker placed the passport into it. Reeves turned and offered it back to Naomi directly. Ma'am, your documents. Naomi accepted them with steady hands. The leather cover was still warm from being held too long by someone who had mistaken possession for authority. Thank you, she said. Her tone remained even, respectful, untouched by triumph. That seemed to unsettle Walker more than anger would have. Reeves lowered the form onto the counter and tapped the time stamp once with his finger. This entry is being corrected, he said. And this stop is being documented for review. A faint shift moved through the people in line. A collective release, so quiet, it was almost invisible. Shoulders lowered. Breath returned. The older woman behind Naomi pressed her lips together and looked at the floor, but her eyes had softened. The young man with the duffel bag lowered his phone halfway, not because the moment was over, but because it had become something heavier than spectacle. Walker stared at the form like it now belonged to someone else. The confidence that had once sat so easily on him had drained away, leaving only stiffness and heat under the fluorescent lights. "Sir, I was following procedure," he said, but even he no longer sounded convinced. Reeves turned to him with the tired patience of a man who had heard too many bad excuses dressed as professionalism. "Procedure is not a shield for bias," he said, "and discretion is not permission to invent cause after the fact." Naomi heard the sentence land in the room and knew it would stay there long after she left. Some truths did that. They attached themselves to walls, to desks, to the people who had heard them and wished they had not. Walker's throat moved as he swallowed. His eyes flicked once toward Naomi, then away again. For the first time since this began, he looked uncertain not just of what to say, but of who he had been while saying all the other things. Reeves gestured toward the terminal. "Amend the record." Walker stepped to the keyboard and began typing. The click of the keys sounded different now, stripped of swagger, reduced to labor. Naomi watched the correction enter the system one line at a time. She thought about how often dignity was delayed by bureaucracy, how often injustice hid inside clerical language, and how rare it was to watch the record bend back toward truth in real time. At the far desk, the second officer quietly returned to work. The line behind Naomi began to move by inches, careful and subdued, as if everyone understood they had just witnessed something larger than a disagreement at a checkpoint. Reeves glanced at Naomi's satchel, where the corner of a casebook still showed through the zipper gap. "You said you teach constitutional law," he said. Naomi nodded. "I do." Reeves studied her for a brief second, then gave the smallest inclination of his head, not dramatic enough to be called an apology for the institution, but close enough to respect to matter. Walker finished typing and stepped back from the terminal. Reeves looked at the updated screen, then at him. "Anything further you need to say to this traveler?" The question hung in the bright air. Walker turned toward Naomi slowly. Whatever came next would not undo the words he had already chosen, or the suspicion he had tried to build around her like a cage. But for the first time, he seemed to understand that he was no longer deciding the shape of the moment alone. Naomi met his eyes and waited, not with vengeance, not even with satisfaction, but with the calm, unwavering stillness of a woman who knew that being right was never the same thing as being cruel, and who had no intention of becoming smaller just to make someone else's shame easier to survive. Walker looked at her for a long second, and when he finally spoke, the room seemed to lean in with him. "I was out of line," he said. The sentence was quiet, stripped of the smug certainty that had carried him earlier, and though it was smaller than the harm he had tried to cause, it was still the first honest thing he had offered all afternoon. Naomi Carter held his gaze and let the words stand on their own. She did not rescue him from them. She did not rush to soften the moment. Under the white fluorescent lights, with the terminal still glowing behind him and the corrected record resting inside the system where it could no longer be denied, honesty sounded less like redemption and more like exposure. Walker swallowed and tried again. "I made assumptions." Naomi saw what it cost him to say even that much. Not because he had suddenly become noble, but because shame had finally reached the place pride had been guarding. Captain Reeves remained silent beside the counter, saying nothing, forcing the apology to live or fail on its own. The line behind Naomi had begun to move in slow, careful inches, but nobody was hurrying now. People were listening with the attentive stillness reserved for rare moments when power was made to answer for itself. Naomi slipped her passport back into her satchel with deliberate care. The leather brushed against the edge of a casebook inside, and the small, familiar sound grounded her. She thought of her classroom waiting 120 miles north, of polished desks, bright student faces, and the lecture she had planned for that evening on constitutional limits and ethical power. She had prepared examples from old cases, appellate opinions, textbook hypotheticals. Yet standing there, with one hand resting lightly on the satchel strap and the other hanging loose at her side, she knew her students would understand this moment faster than any footnote. They would understand the way suspicion had entered the room dressed as routine. They would understand the way procedure had almost become camouflage for prejudice. And they would understand the harder truth too, the one too many people forgot, that dignity did not need to shout in order to survive. Walker's eyes lifted to hers once more. "I am sorry," he said. This time the sentence did not sound rehearsed. It sounded tired. Naomi studied him for a moment, not to punish him, but to decide what kind of ending the moment deserved. She could have spoken sharply. She could have listed every insult hidden inside his conduct, every implication, every quiet cruelty folded into the confidence with which he had first held her passport. Instead, she chose the one thing he had not expected from the beginning: restraint. "Then learn from it," she said. Her voice was low, steady, and clear enough to carry across the counter without force. Authority is not measured by how small you can make someone feel. It is measured by how carefully you handle the power you were trusted with. No one said anything after that. They did not need to. The words settled into the checkpoint with a weight far heavier than anger. Captain Reeves gave a small nod, as though acknowledging not only her composure, but the fact that she had just done what the institution itself often failed to do. She had named the moral boundary in plain language. Naomi turned then and stepped away from the counter. The line parted for her without a word. The older woman behind her touched 2 fingers lightly to her own collarbone, a gesture so brief it might have gone unnoticed by anyone not looking directly at her. The young man with the duffel bag lowered his phone completely and stood aside. Naomi walked toward the glass doors at the far end of the checkpoint, her heels making soft, even sounds against the tile. Beyond the doors, late afternoon light stretched gold across the pavement, warmer than anything inside. She pushed through and stepped into the open air. Wind moved gently across the border lot, lifting the edge of her coat and cooling the heat the building had left on her skin. Behind her, through the glass, Officer Ethan Walker stood beneath the pale lights with his shoulders no longer squared for performance. Just a man in uniform staring at the counter where his certainty had failed him. Naomi did not look back again. She adjusted the satchel on her shoulder, lifted her chin toward the road ahead, and kept walking into the sunlight, while behind her the checkpoint remained silent, as if even the building itself had finally learned that justice did not always arrive loud, but when it arrived true, everyone could feel it.